to the time that God gave the law to Moses. And interestingly enough, large span of time, right? And God had not given His people a written set of statutes during this time. So not a written set of statutes, not a particular set of commandments, not a law that they could exactly look to and live by for these 2,500 years. Why do you think that's the case? Do you think, let me put it this way, do you think God's greatest desire was to give them these laws and statutes to live by? It wasn't. There you go, Bradley. Very good, thank you. If he wanted to, he would have done it from the start, right? But what's his desire? Go all the way back. His desire is for us to choose God without having to be told to do so, right? So that's God's desire for man. He put man here. He gave him freedom of choice. Hey, please choose me. I'm your God. I'm your creator. Please choose me. Well, man didn't do that. And God, of course, being extremely patient, was trying to get man to come around to that idea, but they did not, man did not follow that very well at all. And of course, it got so bad that there you had the flood. And then the new covenant through Abraham said, look, through your seed, I'm going to bring Christ, but once again, on my time, right? So, and to that end, he had this plan that, okay, I'm gonna have Moses, who's going to lead my people out of slavery in the world. And once I lead them out of slavery, I'm going to have to give them some rules to live by, because if not, in this time frame between the time of Moses to the time of Christ, if I don't try to give them these laws to live by, we'll be right back in the same situation we were at the flood, right? So he said, all right, I'm going to give you these laws. I'm going to have to write them down. And I'm going to start with these 10 basic ones. And everything that flows after that is pretty much going to be based on these, okay? If you'll keep these 10, then you'll have a really good start in staying, committed to the one true God. That's what God's trying to do with these laws to the people. Harold.
I've got a little bit different take on that. I don't think God gave them the law so in hopes that they would get better. God being omniscient, He knew they weren't going to get better. I think it's the same thing that God always does. He allows us to see what we need. Before the law, they were all over the place. With the law, they said, we can't do this either. And with Christ, we can't do it. But Christ can do it. I mean, we're no different than them. We finding out there's no way that we can do it. And I think that's what he was doing with them.
So the whole, and so Harold says a lot of it is it's a prelude to Christ, right? Whether the law is something that God expected them to do, expected them to be able to keep, or whether He knew He was going to keep it or not, it was still just a prelude to Christ, who had to come in order to fulfill the law, and who had to come in order for us to have that opportunity to be right with God, right? So that whole thought is that it's kind of, obviously we don't have the mind of God, and so it's hard for us to understand what it means that God gave man a choice and yet He knew what choice man was going to make. That's hard for us to wrap our minds around as just humans. But and it's hard for us to get the idea that God, that the Bible even tells us that God even at times was, I don't know if the right word is regretful, but he was sorry in a way that he made man. And it wasn't because of God's creation, it was because of man's choices, right? Because of man's choices. So he knew, and that's good, another good point, he knew that in creating this law, it was a prelude to Christ. Christ had to come. It wasn't that God said this is the law and he expected them to be able to keep it. He knew that they were going to fall short on it too. But it was a guideline in hopes that they would, because as he gave them this law, and you see here in these 3 chapters of Deuteronomy, 4, 5, and 6 here, when you read these chapters multiple times, you see that that was God's command, and his desire for his people is, here's this law, keep it. You know, his command for them was to keep it. Now, as we see throughout the history of God's people, through the Israelites, throughout their history, they did, and then they didn't, and then they would, and then they wouldn't, right? They couldn't stay true to what God wanted them to do. They would for a time, and then they'd fall away. So, but the law here did at least somewhat keep them in check with what, so they could see it right in front of them and know what was right and wrong. And so he gave them this law here in Exodus, and then repeats it here in Deuteronomy to the people, so that they know when they go into to the promised land, when they get into the promised land, they're going to have these rules to live by. And he said, if you've got them, then you need to read them, you need to keep them in front of you, you need to tell them to your children, you need to tell them your children's children. They need to be extremely familiar with the law of God. Now, that's another great thing for us to learn from this. If God says, here's 10 commandments, and you need to make sure that you know them, that your kids know them, and that your kids' kids know them, then what a great lesson for us, right? God says, here's the Bible. Make sure you know it, make sure your kids know it, and make sure your kids' kids know it, right? That's what, the same thing he was telling them, he's given us an even better opportunity to be able to pick up the Word of God, read it, teach it to our kids, and they can teach it to their kids. That idea of what he was trying to get Moses and the people to do about remembering them, because why did he want them to remember the law? Because he said the law would make them wise, meaning they could discern what was right and wrong so they can make the right choices. It would give them knowledge over the world around them, and they could stay committed to God. Well, if that was true for them with this law, then isn't it definitely true for us and the law of liberty, the law of Christ, that we have? For sure it is. For sure it is. So we can't say, just like the people, the Israelites, people of God then, they couldn't say, hey, I've read the law and I know it well, and still make all the mistakes they made if they were rooted in the law. But the problem is, so oftentimes they left their reading of the law. They forgot it. They forgot to remind themselves of it, forgot to remind their kids of it. And so when they did that, they grew away from God. And oftentimes they were, God tried to remind them, go back to what the basics are and remind yourselves of them and do it over and over again. Okay? So, to kind of get us back to on track to where we are, really, remember, we're talking about this idea of what we believe in, common ground to share with somebody else, right? And so when we do that, one of the first things we said is we believe in God, right? That's it. So what are the characteristics that we begin to see in God through the Ten Commandments, because that's what we're sharing with people when we take that message to God out. We are sharing our knowledge, our God, with them. When we say, I believe in God, well, what are the characteristics of the God that you believe in? And He begins to show them to you here in the Ten Commandments. I think one of the interesting things about this is you read those first three. We started talking about last week. We're going to finish these three up and kind of move on. But when you read these, the world has created their God, little g, that is in defiance with the basic principles of our God, big G. And what I mean by, and I mean very basic, because look, here's His Ten Commandments, and what are the first three, right? What are the very first three? No other gods before me, no other gods. Don't make any kind of image that's a god, and don't take my name in vain. He repeats this. I said it last week. It's definitely worth repeating again. He says at least 3 times in these 3 chapters that He's a jealous God. He is a jealous God. The world we live in does not describe God as a jealous God. They say God is a what? They love to say God's a forgiving God, which He is. Extremely forgiving, extremely merciful. But you've got to take that mercy and put it together with the idea that He's also very jealous. So when you add that in, it's like, oh, wait a minute. When I say God is a jealous God, what does that mean? And it means that He's the only one. There's no other. Period. So if you go out into the world and somebody says, well, yeah, I understand, you can believe in your God and that's okay. I'll believe in my God and this is how I'll be it, and we'll end up at the same place. No, that's just not going to happen. Okay? And one of the things that we have, so in the process of our changing culture, and the culture and society we live in does affect the church, whether we like to admit it or not. But one of the things that I think we see is the church of 50 years ago, even the church that met here 50 years ago, the lessons and the sermons and the process of how things went about doesn't look, it looks somewhat like the church of today, but it is different, isn't it? Because the world influences it some. Now, that's not all bad. Don't get me wrong. But I'm just saying, I know growing up in the church before that here, that the way that we met together and the sermons you would hear, they're different. That's not a bad thing, okay? So don't get me saying that where we are now is bad. That's not true. But we have to be extremely careful with that, because some things that we were, you might say, very dogmatic or very strict about, we've somewhat relaxed. And once again, we're not going to talk about those right now, but I'm just saying it is different. But what we have to be careful with is not relaxing things that we shouldn't, like the very qualities of God, which says He's a jealous God, and say, that's all right, you can believe what you want to believe, and yeah, we'll end up at the same place. That's not going to happen. And let's make sure that when we go out into the world that we don't portray that. Yeah, let's be forgiving and very merciful, but let's also let them know that, hey, the God I believe in, the God of the Bible, the God that we are certain of, is a jealous God. Don't put anything in front of him. You're not going to like the outcome. Let's make sure that's true. And what is even more, here he says, he's the God. Don't make another God, and don't take my name in vain. And this is the one that we talked about a lot last week, and let's talk about it just a little bit more today. Because I think this tells us how strongly and how important it is that we recognize Him and Him only. Don't take my name in vain. Words do mean something. Words mean a lot. I don't think people think about all the things that come out of their mouth, but I like how Chad put it this idea of vanity, it's a recognition, or maybe it's the lack of recognition for who our God really is. And that can be done through saying words that we shouldn't say, but it can also be done when we put, what is vanity anyway? Putting anything before God, right? In a lot of ways. That's what vanity is, putting ourselves before Him. It's all vanity, meaning that, as Solomon said, we're putting the world and all the worldly things before God. Don't take God's name in vain. If you're going to invoke God for something, make sure that it's what God would approve of. And I think sometimes, and this is where, like I said, maybe my demeanor has changed a little bit over the years, but there does need to be a line that when it gets crossed, we need to let others know where we are. And that's the same thing about, I was telling you about the idea of being out in work and having people take the Lord's name in vain as we generally think of it, and having to say, hey, I don't appreciate that. Doing it lovingly and kindly, but at the same time making sure they know where you stand. And most all the time the response is, I'm sorry, and they won't do it around you again because they know the kind of person you are. Well, to keep, sometimes it's a whole lot easier just to keep your mouth shut in those situations. And that's historically, I think, that's what I did. But there are times when we need to be bold enough to stand up and say, look, that's not who my God is. That's not who the God is. The God says, I'm it. You better recognize that I'm it. No other gods. And when you use my name in speech and you invoke my name for whatever purpose, make sure you're doing it the correct way and with the respect that is due our Creator. Keep that in your mind. Read that over and over again. That's why I think it's so good to read the Ten Commandments. Don't read them just to say, yeah, I haven't done that. Yeah, I'm not a murderer. Yeah, I've not bore witness against my neighbor. Yeah, I haven't done this. Read them for what the purpose of God was trying to do here was to keep Him first, to keep family second, and to keep the love for your neighbor right there with it. And, it all goes back to when Christ says, what's the greatest commandment? Love God, love your neighbor as yourself. That's found right here, okay? That's what He says, to love God, to love your family, love your neighbor. That all goes together, and we see it right here in the Ten Commandments. Now, here's what I'm going to do, because I know at some point y'all are going to ask me this or comment on it. You're going to say, okay, how about this fourth commandment about the Sabbath, right? Because it doesn't seem to fit into your categories of those three. Well, it does. It does fit in the category of the first one about remembering God. But it goes much deeper than that. And we're going to make a whole separate lesson on it. It's coming up. But if you're thinking about that, read Hebrews, specifically Hebrews 4. And we're going to get into that in a few weeks. But let's concentrate on these three primary things for right now. All right, so let's go back to this idea then of respecting the God that we know, that is our Creator, who did everything to put the children of Israel in the place that they are in when He gives them the law. He said, look, I'm leading you into the promised land. I've done all this for you, and I'm going to protect you. Just follow these rules. Okay? I'm going to protect you. Just follow these rules. And so God, presents them to them and says, here it is, and they go back and forth between keeping them and not keeping them, right? All the way up to the time of Christ. And then there's a relationship, and all this is foreshadowing the coming of Christ and what it's going to mean to us and to them from that perspective when Christ comes. So when we say we believe in God, and we believe in the God of the Bible that is merciful but also very jealous, that He's it, there's no other, then it's interesting. He makes that point first, and then he goes right into this relationship that we have with family. And so, Chad, I'm trying not to step on your Wednesday night class, but it's interesting of how, and the intent was not even to do that, but it ended up there anyway. Why? Because it's that simple. It's those relationships, that's what it's about. A relationship with God, a relationship with family, a relationship with our neighbor. So when we look at the very next thing there, it says, and in verse 16, okay, Deuteronomy 5:16, honor your father and your mother, as the Lord your God has commanded you, that your days will be prolonged and that it may go well with you on the land which the Lord your God gives you. So He's sending them into this new land, and the most important relationship they have here on earth, of course, is with God. But the communication between them, the first thing He tells them, as far as communication between them, is their respect for their mother and father. Honor your mother and honor your father as the Lord has commanded you. Where do you think that stands today? If we're just to look at once again, that's why I think it's so great to sometimes just go back and just read the basics of what God is telling His people here. Remember me, I'm it. Honor your father and your mother. Oh, wait a minute. Those go right there next to each other? Yes, here we're talking about just 10 commandments and how quickly the world deviates from those. So, what are your thoughts? Where do you think that relationship, honor your father and mother, where did that go? Where's it at today? It's not in many ways. That's a good way to say it too. It's not, right? And why do you think that is true? I think it's true from both directions, right? It's true because, number one, let's start with this basic concept of the idea that God created man and woman, and He made them to be a father and a mother, and He put them in a situation to raise children and to teach them about God. So if they do that, then they're supposed to be honored, right? So just that basic relationship, father, mother, children, it's always been. I've said this multiple times, and it's it's good to, once again, remind ourselves of it. You know, when God sent Christ, He didn't just send somebody who was up there with Him. Who did He send? He sent His Son, right? When we think of our family relationships, we should also think of the very God that created everything has that same family relationship. He's God, and He has a Son. There's a family there. So you think family's important to Him? Yeah, I think it's pretty important to Him. And I think it's so important to Him that He says this is how it's set up, and you better respect it. Tears you. Yes.
I think also if you could honor and respect your parents, you're also, trickling down, you're going to respect your spouse as well. And if the spouse, again, it just all trickles down. If your spouse and yourself can respect each other, then your children will do the same.
That's a great point. It does. It all follows. And fresh on that thought is, God didn't design it and not know what it meant. Meaning that He designed it because that's exactly how it works. As you said, it trickles down. It makes perfect sense. If the mother and father are honored and respected, then likely they're the kind of family unit they ought to be. They respect each other, and that's shown to the kids, and the kids show that to their kids, just like passing down of the law. So that is entirely correct. And this idea, I think, Stacy and I and Jonathan were talking about this yesterday, actually. This idea of this three-stranded cord. When you go back to, as Bradley said, this idea of the threes, when you look at Scripture, numbers mean a lot of things. And this idea of three, Father, Son, Holy Ghost, the whole idea of 3 days, 3 nights, and the three-stranded cord. There's so many things that belong in threes in Scripture that God does that in order for us, I think, to grasp that concept. A lot of times He puts it in numbers, but He does that, I think, simply to remind ourselves of, hey, if we'll keep these basic things, just like the idea of respecting your parents, keep those basic things in front of you, it's going to be a whole lot better for you. And when it says that your days may be prolonged, I'll tell you, generally speaking, when there's not a respect for parents, someone's life is going to be, it may be cut short physically, but it's definitely going to be cut short spiritually, right? You're not going to be blessed as a person if you don't honor your father and mother. It's that simple. Because that's a commandment, and it is just like honoring God. It's that same type of thought process, same kind of relationship we have to remind ourselves of. Chet. It's a big picture understanding. That's right, just like in 1 John, as Chad says. So it's it's interesting, I've read how many of us have read the Ten Commandments? Hundreds of times, right? But every time I read them, especially when I was preparing for this, I was like, oh wait, this groups together real well. I don't know that I'd ever seen that before, but I'd read it hundreds of times, right? But God makes it that simple. It's simple for us to understand. It's simple for us to group together and say, yeah, there's a God, and He expects us to keep a family relationship because that's how He made us, and He expects us to love the people that are around us. And so that's exactly what He set forth to His children going back to the Promised Land. Here's how you need to handle this look, I'm giving you everything you need. I'm sending you back to the land of milk and honey. You've got it all. You're gonna live in places, if you remember, if you read into chapter 5 and chapter 6, you're gonna live in places you didn't even have to grow the vineyard. You didn't even have to make the grapes. You're gonna be next to this fertile place. You can grow anything you want to grow. And it's all already pre-done for you. I'm giving it right back to you. Just follow my rules. Man had a lot of trouble with that. All right, back to this idea of a family. So you can apply several of these commandments throughout the concept of family, but the two main ones, verse 16 there, honor your father and mother, and then verse 18, don't commit adultery. So, the whole concept there is stay committed. And this idea of not committing adultery, it's when you look at that word, adultery, throughout Scripture, it's used most of the time as a concept between a husband and wife, which is more than likely the concept that is meant here. But it's also used between a concept of people and their God. Meaning, yeah, you can cheat on your God too, just like you cheat on your spouse. And so when it says don't commit adultery, anytime you see that, think that it is a committed relationship that has been made, and it's not one taken lightly at all, obviously. It's a full commitment, and that commitment generally is seen with, from a biblical perspective, between a man and a woman, and between a person and their God, and those go hand in hand, right? So when he says don't commit adultery, I think the Bible is pretty clear. If you're committing adultery with against your spouse, then you're also breaking that devotion, not with just them, but with God too. And those go together, right? So this idea of adultery is, you've heard of this, that phrase, adulterous generation, right? That's what he spoke of with sometimes when the children of Israel would not act the way they should. They were being unfaithful to their God, just like a man or a woman can be unfaithful to their spouse. Yeah, Harold.
From you shall not commit murder on down, every one of those commandments deals with you're taking something that is not yours. I mean, that's the same way Satan did with us. God owns us, and he's taking something that's not his.
So, what a great way to put it. Harold says, when you look at all those and it says don't do these things, whether it's adultery or murder or false witness, whatever it is, you're taking something that is not yours. Which is very interesting because God's blessed us with everything we need, and yet man wants to take something that's not his. Right? That's a great it's a great insight and a great way to put it. And God is saying, if you'll keep me first, keep your family first, keep those relationships with your neighbor first, you won't be looking for things that aren't yours, right? You won't be looking for things that aren't yours. Well, that's very good insight, and that's a great place to pause. We'll just stop right there. I like that. So continue to read these. We're going to talk some more next week about these 10 Commandments. Try to finish this thought up. Remember, we are discussing about the things we believe in, and the basis of what God is telling His people here is something that has never changed, and it's still something that we can read and learn from and apply the way we're supposed to even today. All right, who's got our prayer?